Hey everyone, it's Chris Barnes from East Brunswick Public Library. You are listening to our Read, Watch, Listen podcast. Today we have a special guest who is actually from East Brunswick and one of our highest profile guests to date, if not the highest profile. He is the winner of the 2008 Caldecott Medal, which is one of the biggest awards in children's literature. And he also won the 2017 Inkpot Award, which is one of the biggest awards in comic books. I am very happy to have illustrator author Brian Selznick on our show today. Brian, how are you doing? And thank you so much for coming on our show today.
Great, Chris. It's really nice to be here with you. Thank you so much.
So you have done so many things. I'd like to say maybe best known for the invention of Hugo Cabaret. I don't even know where to begin to talk about your career, so I'm going to ask you to.
It begins in East Brunswick. I was born not too far from East Brunswick, but I moved to East Brunswick when I was probably 4 or 5 and spent the rest of my childhood there up until I was 18 and went to college. So it was really the East Brunswick public schools where I discovered art, and it was the East Brunswick Public Library where I spent so much time reading and looking at books. And when I was growing up, there was also a section where you could check out art and sculptures and things like that. So I remember checking out Egyptian sculptures and things like that, and it was really great. So yeah, so it all began in East Brunswick, and then I went to RISD, Rhode Island School of Design. Tried to not be a children's book illustrator because that's what everyone told me when I was growing up, and failed. And so after college, I decided I should in fact be a children's book illustrator and got a job at a place called Eeyores Books for Children in New York. And I was commuting from my parents' house in East Brunswick for like a year, working at the store before I finally moved to the city. And my first book was published while I was still working at the store. And yeah, my mom still lives in East Brunswick. So I go back very regularly to the house I grew up in.
Very cool. And on behalf of our staff, I would like you to know that you are still highly regarded by many of our longtime coworkers. When they found out that we were recording you on our podcast today, they were like, I've known Brian forever. He is so great. I remember him coming here when he was a kid. So you are a well-loved super library user. So
Oh my God, that's so amazing. Well, hello to everybody. And I will say, when I was living at my parents' house after college, working at Eeyores, I was working on my first book, which eventually became the Houdini box. And I did a huge amount of that research at the East Brunswick Public Library. And I remember specifically the desk I was sitting in, the file I was going through, and it was at the library where I found an article or a copy of an article in the file about Houdini that said that essentially the story that I had made up when I was in college about a kid who finds a magical box that may have actually belonged to Houdini was true. So I had made that up. And at the library, I found an article from the 70s, and the headline was Magician's Box Still Being Sought, something like that. And there really were rumors of a locked box of secrets that Houdini had left behind. And so I made a copy of that, and it still hangs on the wall in my studio where I live now.
that's very cool. Did they ever open the box?
Well, they've never actually found it. The article said that it was still being looked for. So if you come across anything, let me know, please.
I think I might put our reference desk to work as soon as I get off the podcast with you so we can get an update on this and we will edit it into the podcast in our show notes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So now, as I know you do both work as an author and an illustrator, do you prefer one or both?
Well, I can draw, so I really like drawing, and I was trained as an artist, and I grew up drawing, and I came to writing a bit later. But in the end, I feel a little bit like I'm really just a storyteller, and I tell stories, and the way that I tell stories is with words and pictures, and it's always the challenge of figuring out what the words are supposed to do, what the pictures are supposed to do, and how they work together. So it's not that I like one more than the other, but I like the ways in which I've been able to play with the words and the pictures and put them together. And I was trying to figure out which I find easier, like if there's one that's easier as opposed to one I like better. But I think they're both really hard. And so I like writing, but finding the best way to tell the story. I like drawing, but making sure that everything looks the way I want it to look. And we all know that getting that thing that's in your head out into the world, whatever it is we're, trying to do, can be challenging because the thing that's in our head is often much better than the thing that we are trying to put down on paper. I just try to make it as close as I can and work as hard as I can to get it. So I like them both, and I'm frustrated by both of them in different ways.
I think that I'm good. I'm not even going to bother to try to paraphrase it, but there's a great quote from Jack Kirby along those lines about the best part about writing and drawing your own material is that you're only limited by what you can think of creating. And if it's not turning out the way you like it, you can completely move on from it.
That's great. Yes, no one's going to know if it's not what's exactly in your head. The only person you're really trying to make sure feels that it's right is yourself, and you are communicating. You do have to get it across in some fashion. That's what books are, and all the media we're going to talk about today. It's ways in which people communicate. So you are trying to communicate. You're not just talking to yourself when you're making stuff. But at least for me, it starts with me trying to tell the best story that I possibly can.
Very cool. Okay, so I guess this is a perfect way to segue. So, Brian, what have you been reading?
Well, I'm just today finishing my next book. And so I've been drawing for the past 3 or 4 months and doing the finished art. And so when I'm finishing the art, I listen to audiobooks. And so I become the most well-read person in the world because I basically listen all the time I'm drawing, which is like 6 to 7 days a week for like 8 to 10 hours a day. And so you can get a lot of books in at that point. And then I always do try to have a physical book or two going as well. But the the book that I just finished on audiobook is Remembrance of Things Past, which is actually 7 volumes. And I think I've read it has over 1 million words in it. And I think it took me a month and a half to listen to the entire thing. And it's something I would never recommend to anybody, but having finished it, I loved it. So that was the main thing that I've been reading. And then when I finished it, I started listening to books about remembrance of things past. In Search of Lost Time, which I guess is the newer translation of the title by Marcel Proust. And so I've been listening to a lot of books about the way he wrote it and biographies and things like that. And then before that, I was listening to a lot of fun audio books, like autobiographies. The Harvey Fierstein, the writer and actor who did La Cage aux Folles and Hairspray and Newsies and Kinky Boots, has a great autobiography that he narrates. And he has a very sort of trademark raspy voice like this. And he has a book about his life called I Was Better Last Night, which is, I guess, what he would say to people who came to see him in a show. I was better last night. And it's really, really funny. It's filled with really amazing stories. And I'm friends with a amazing drag performer named Charles Busch. And he had a very, very important show called The Vampire Lesbians of Sodom in, I think, in the 70s or 80s, which was a very, very big hit off Broadway, then off Broadway. And he eventually had a show on Broadway that was called The Tale of the Allergist's Wife. And he also has a wonderful new autobiography that he narrates called Leading Lady that I also just finished, which I really, really loved. And then on the physical book side, I just finished a book of really fantastic essays by a writer named Judith Thurman, who does a lot of work for the New Yorker. She writes a lot of essays for them. She actually wrote the book that Out of Africa was based on about Isaac Dinesen. And this book, Left-Handed Woman, is a series of essays that are mostly about women in all aspects of the arts, of the sciences, throughout history. And it's just amazing. A single short essay, she's able to bring people to very, very vivid, clear life. There's a great essay about Amelia Earhart. There's a great essay about all these fashion designers and sort of the importance and relevance and cultural meaning of fashion, which she really gets into. I've been doing a good amount of reading both audio and physical. And the latest physical book I just bought was by a really important queer scholar named Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. And she has a really, really great book about Proust. Proust was one of her favorite writers, and she talked about him a lot. She had a book that she was working on when she died, and it's called The Weather in Proust. And it looks at basically taking the weather in the story as a launching point to look at the way in which Marcel Proust saw the world, and just beginning it, and it's really, really fantastic.
Very, very cool. A lot of varied stuff there. I have one question for you. We don't know the answer to this, so you can make it up and we have no way of proving it. Do you remember what the last book you borrowed from East Brunswick Public Library was?
Ah, that's such a good question. I would bet that it was the Houdini scrapbook, which is a big, yellow, amazing book of photographs about Houdini that I checked out when I was working on the Houdini box in 1990. The book came out in 91. And I loved it so much, I actually eventually bought myself a copy so that I could have it at home. But if this book called the Houdini Scrapbook is still on the shelf, it might have my name in the back of the book somewhere.
Well, that's going to be my afternoon project as soon as we get off the Zoom here. Okay, so we talked about what you've been reading. What have you been watching lately? This could be television shows, movies.
Yeah, so I have been watching a lot of Project Runway. My husband and I realized that we had missed the last couple of seasons. So we just finished season 18, which was very satisfying, by the way. And we've just begun season 19, which is the one that they do post-pandemic. There's a TV show I discovered on Netflix called Million Dollar Decorators, which is as ridiculous as the title sounds, but it's for some reason it's extremely compelling watching these folks as they try to manage their somewhat insane clients. And we all know editing is used to, up aspects of the various stories, but I really enjoyed the one season of that was filmed before it was shut down for the pandemic, and I don't think it started up again. I also started watching this show called The Home Edit with these two women who organize everything in your house or do a specific project in a room, and they are very obsessed with rainbows and try to organize everything to look like rainbows. And I watched a bunch of episodes until I kind of found myself needing to stop watching the show, and just it got on my nerves a little bit. But I will say it did inspire me to organize a lot of things in my house that I have been meaning to organize for a long time. So I have a nice new organized closet, some stuff in the kitchen. I believe while we were talking, my doorbell rang and it was IKEA dropping off a new shelf system for the bedroom. That's going to be a surprise for my husband. And so that's been really fun. And I've seen a couple of movies lately, mostly on the television. I've been wanting to get back to the movie theater. Haven't been to a movie in a theater since New Year's, because every New Year's Eve, my husband and I do a three-movie New Year's where we do movie lunch, movie dinner, and then usually movie over midnight. And this year we did Miyazaki's supposedly last film, The Boy and the Heron, which is an animated film, and it's really, really gorgeous. And if anyone has not seen Miyazaki's other films like My Neighbor Totoro or Princess Mononoke, I highly recommend them. They're incredibly beautiful and moving and profound and
They are.
strange.
And I don't believe him that that's his last one.
I know, well, he has said that the last three movies were his last movies. So it would be very nice if there were more to come. I have my fingers crossed that there are, but the rumor is that this actually is his last movie, but we'll see. And then we saw All of Us Strangers, and then we saw Poor Things, which is just insane. And Emma Stone gives a really, really bizarre and incredible performance. And then on TV, we watched The Holdovers with Paul Giamatti. And the whole movie is filmed as if it was made in the 70s. It's set in 1970 or 71. And it's about a kid and a teacher who get sort of stuck at a boarding school over a winter holiday, and the ways in which they bond and learn things about each other. And there's a woman who works in the cafeteria who is there with them. And it's a really, really sort of quiet, beautiful film. And so that's really what I've been watching of late.
No, no, all good stuff there. So, and our last question is, what do you listen to? I mean, I know we need to talk about audiobooks, but what's on the soundtrack to the everyday life of Brian Selznick?
So I listen to very, very little music. My husband he really loves music and has a huge record collection. I think we have three record players in our four-room apartment, and we have closets and cabinets filled with records, beautiful old LPs, new LPs. And he listens to a lot of jazz and a lot of standards. And so I often am just listening to what he's listening to. But one of the things that we have discovered that we really love listening to is the soundtrack to the Holdovers. And so I had said that the movie is made as if it's a film that was actually from the 70s. And they made the soundtrack really feel like the soundtrack from a movie from the early 70s. There's Cat Stevens on it. And there's some new songs, but they're done in the style of the early 70s. And I don't very often listen to movie soundtracks. Like the last one I really remember loving and listening to over and over again was the Star Wars soundtrack in 1977. I used to listen to that all the time. Although then I did get really obsessed with the Amadeus soundtrack in the 1980s. And really that was my real introduction to Mozart. So I used to listen to that all the time. So we've been listening to the Holdovers a lot. And then every Sunday, David and I have a ritual that we've done for many years now, where when we wake up, he makes a couple of good cups of coffee, and we listen to a singer named Nico, who performed with Lou Reed and I think, was produced by Andy Warhol. And she was part of the factory, part of that scene. And it's a very beautiful and very strange album. I think she only made one solo album, but she sang backup on a lot of other things you may have heard of. But we listen to her every Sunday. And then David has a few other songs, a few other musicians sort of in that genre that we listen to afterwards. And then the one other thing that I do find myself listening to a lot with David is a band from the early 80s called the Would Be Goods. And they've got this really kind of ephemeral, intellectual, very beautiful sound. And I highly, highly recommend them. Look them up and I don't know, I just think they have a really unusual point of view. And it was David's favorite band when he was in high school. And so I've been listening to them for a long time with David. And so yeah, so that's what I've been listening to. And then I guess the only other thing I'd really listen to while I'm working or during the day are some podcasts. And a lot of the podcasts that I've been listening to have been about art. When I'm working, I do often find myself wanting to listen to something that does feel like it has something to do with what I'm working on. I have found a couple of really great podcasts about art. There's one called Talk Art with the actor Russell Tovey and a friend of his who's a gallerist. And they have wonderful guests on, artists and people who themselves are gallerists. And they get really into the work that these artists and fashion designers and editors and critics have done over the course of their lives. And it's really, really fantastic. I was in Rome during the pandemic. My husband won something called the Rome Prize. And there was a painting conservator who also won the Rome Prize named Jean Dommermuth. And she started a podcast called What is a Painting? That's fantastic. And it looks at the material life of paintings. And so we often think of paintings just as two-dimensional things that don't have any form. But in fact, they're often painted, which is a physical thing. You have to get the paint onto the canvas somehow, if it's canvas. You have to make the canvas, you have to stretch the canvas, it has to hang on the wall somehow. And not all paintings are on canvas. Some are on metal, some are on plastic, some are directly on the walls. And so she looks at the life of these paintings, both modern art and ancient, in very, very intriguing ways. Yeah, and so those are some of the things that I've been listening to.
All right. So, Brian, that sounds like a lot of interesting things here. We will have in our show notes links to where you can get most of that here at East Brunswick Public Library. Brian, you've got a bunch of projects that we know that you can't talk about, but they're coming sooner than later. Is there anywhere online that we can follow you to keep up on your latest updates?
Yeah, I have a website that's thebrianselznick.com because for some reason brianselznick.com was taken already. And so if you go to thebrianselznick.com, it links to websites I've made about a lot of my books and then has information about movies that have been adapted from my books, theater work I've done. I'm also a professional puppeteer, so it has information about the puppetry that I've done. And you can find a lot of stuff there. And I'm on Instagram at the Brian Selznick as well.
Brian, thank you again for being on our show. You are very interesting. I have so many follow-up questions. We could do a whole library podcast just based on your interests, your hobbies. I know no one can watch this, but when Brian was talking earlier about the organizational shows that he was watching on Netflix, behind him is the most immaculate, well put together bookshelf. And I am in such envy and in awe and inspired at the same time.
Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you again so much for being our special guest today. Special thanks to our producer, Melissa Hozick. You can check us out for more of our latest programs and podcasts at ebpl.org. For East Brunswick Public Library, I'm Chris Barnes. Again, Brian, thank you for being on the show today.
All right. It was great to talk to you. Thanks so much.